In the spring of '98, in a rent-controlled building on East 79th Street between Lexington and 3rd, a contractor removing water-damaged plaster exposed something that should not have existed. The building superintendent had called about flooding in what lease documents described as garden-level apartments, units with windows looking up at sidewalk level, their ceilings crossed by pipes and ducts. When the wall came down, beneath layers of horsehair plaster and lathe, the contractor found plate glass. Not fragments, not broken panes repurposed as backing. Full sheets, 10 feet tall, still mounted in iron frames, facing inward. The glass that should have faced the street was now sealed inside. Apartment walls. The inventory records, typed on Department of Buildings carbon copies dated 1952, made no mention of storefronts. The conversion permit described residential subdivision of existing residential space. Yet here was the glass that had once displayed goods to pedestrians, now entombed behind domestic walls, catching only the dim light of a superintendent's flashlight. The superintendent, a man named Viktor Chernov, who had worked in the building since 1987, stood in the flooded apartment and felt cold air moving through cracks in the newly exposed glass. The temperature differential suggested the space beyond was unheated. When he pressed his palm to the glass, dust on the far side shifted slightly, disturbed by vibration from the street above. According to the building's official history, maintained in a leather binder in the management office, the structure had been erected in 1923 as an apartment house. The architectural drawings filed with the city showed residential units from foundation to roof, no retail spaces, no commercial zoning. Yet the glass frames bore manufacturer's marks from 1921, 2 years before construction supposedly began. The dates did not align. On the 3rd of November, 1921, in the offices of the Real Estate Record and Builder's Guide on Liberty Street, a clerk recorded a building permit for the address on East 79th Street. The notation, preserved in the municipal archives in a ledger with water-stained edges, time 450 describes construction of 5-story taxpayer with ground floor commercial spaces and upper residential floors. The term taxpayer referred to low-cost buildings designed to generate just enough revenue to cover property taxes, while landowners waited for property values to rise. The permit specifies 12 storefronts at street level, each with plate glass windows measuring 10 feet by 8 feet, with residential entrances set between commercial bays. A marginal note, added in different ink in a cramped hand, reads, "Revised 1923, residential only." No explanation follows. The original permit was never formally amended. The revision appears only as an annotation, squeezed into the margin as if added reluctantly. By the winter of 1923, time 50 in the construction yards along the East River, where building materials arrived by barge, limestone facing, and iron window frames sat stacked beneath canvas tarps. A photograph preserved in the collection of the Museum of the City of New York, dated 12th of January 1923, shows the skeleton of the building on East 79th Street. The frame rises 5 stories, structural steel bolted and riveted. Under this video, you'll see a thanks button, a small gesture with a big meaning. By pressing it, you're not only supporting the creation of more content like this, but you're also becoming part of the very exchange we've been talking about, giving and receiving in harmony. It's not about the size of the gesture, it's about the meaning. A simple super thanks tells me these words reached you. It tells me that the effort, the late nights, and the discipline to bring this message forward, that it mattered to someone on the other side of the screen. At ground level, the photograph captures something that the revised permit does not mention. Storefronts, wide bays with iron lintels, designed for large windows. The spaces are empty, but the proportions are wrong for residential use. The ceiling height at ground level measures 12 feet, standard for retail. The floors above show 8-foot ceilings, standard for apartments. The photograph, catalogued as East 79th Street construction, winter 1923, contradicts the official narrative that the building was always residential. Yet city records insist otherwise. In the autumn of 1929, as financial markets collapsed and construction loans evaporated, landlords across Manhattan faced a crisis. Buildings designed with ground floor retail spaces stood empty. Storefronts that were meant to house haberdashers, tobacconists, and druggists remained vacant, generating no revenue. Property taxes still came due. A document preserved in the archives of the Citizens Housing and Planning Council dated 14th of October 1929, Times 400s, describes a solution: convert unused commercial spaces to residential use. The author, an attorney named Samuel Hirsch, outlines the legal mechanism. Under existing housing codes, commercial spaces could be reclassified as residential if the owner filed an affidavit stating the space had been improved for dwelling purposes. No inspection was required, no architectural review, simply a notarized statement and a small filing fee. The document notes that such conversions allowed landlords to collect rent while avoiding commercial vacancy taxes. The plate glass windows posed a problem. Residential codes required privacy. But the solution was simple: build walls in front of the glass, leaving the original, storefront structure intact but hidden. The technique spread quickly. By 1931, in buildings from Morningside Heights to Yorkville, ground floor commercial spaces were vanishing behind new walls. A building inspector's report from the 3rd of March, 1931, preserved in a file marked Residential Conversions, Query, describes visiting a building on Amsterdam Avenue where storefronts had been converted to apartments. The inspector, a man named Thomas Brennan, noted that the original plate glass windows remained in place, now facing interior walls rather than the street. New brick facades had been erected in front of the storefronts, with small residential windows cut through at sidewalk level. The effect, Brennan wrote, Sim 300 Malums, was that the apartments appeared to be built partially below grade, with windows looking up at the street from what seemed like basement level. The occupants, he noted, live in what was once retail space, now buried behind new walls. The ceiling height is generous, but the light is poor. The windows, being at sidewalk level, admit only indirect illumination. One feels as though one is underground, though the floor level is in fact even with the street. His report concludes with a question written in the margin and left unanswered. Is this legally residential space or merely commercial space renamed? No official response to Brennan's question exists in the archives. The conversions continued. By 1935, hundreds of former storefronts in Manhattan had been transformed into what lease documents described as garden apartments or English basement apartments, terms that suggested charm and architectural intention rather than economic desperation. The language mattered. A basement apartment implied substandard housing, something built below grade, possibly illegal. A garden apartment suggested something deliberate, even desirable. Yet the physical reality remained the same. Units with high ceilings and windows at sidewalk level, where pedestrians' shoes passed at eye level and delivery trucks idled outside, their diesel exhaust seeping through aging window seals. On the 8th of June 1938, in a hearing room at the Department of Housing and Buildings on Center Street, a tenant named Rose Feldman testified about her apartment on West 88th Street. The stenographer's transcript, preserved in a file labeled Habitability Complaints, 1938, records her description. The windows are at the level of the sidewalk. People walk past and look in. I have to keep the curtains drawn all day. In summer, the heat from the pavement makes the apartment unbearable. The landlord says it is a garden apartment, but there is no garden, only concrete. When asked whether she had been told the space was once commercial, Feldman replied that she had not. I was told it was always apartments, but the ceilings are very high, and there are strange spaces behind the walls. When you knock, it sounds hollow, as if there is a room back there that you cannot reach. The hearing officer, a man named Milton Schwartz, noted in his summaries that the building's 1924 certificate of occupancy listed the ground floor as retail, 12 units. A 1932 amendment changed this to residential, 12 units. No structural modifications were documented. The rooms had simply been relabeled. In the decades that followed, the original purpose of these spaces faded from collective memory. By the 1950s, in buildings across the Upper West Side and the East Village, tenants living in what they believed were basement apartments had no knowledge that they occupied former shops. The plate glass windows remained sealed behind walls, forgotten. The high ceilings, the wide floor plans, the unusual proportions, all were dismissed as eccentricities of old construction. A study conducted in 1956 by the Citizens Budget Commission, preserved in the New York Public Library's Municipal Documents Collection, noted that approximately 18% of ground floor residential units in pre-war buildings showed characteristics inconsistent with original residential design. The report speculated that many were repurposed commercial spaces, but concluded that since the conversions predated modern record-keeping requirements, documentation was sparse and often contradictory. The official record, the report stated, reflects what the building became, not what it was. On the 2nd of September 1987, in a law office on Park Avenue, an attorney named David Shapiro reviewed lease documents for a rent-stabilized apartment on East 83rd Street. His client, a tenant facing eviction, claimed the apartment was illegally subdivided. Shapiro noticed something in the building's chain of title, a 1928 certificate of occupancy listing the ground floor as commercial, followed by a 1933 certificate listing the same floor as residential. No renovation permit connected the two documents. When Shapiro visited the building, the superintendent, a different man from Viktor Chernov, but with the same institutional knowledge that comes from decades of maintaining old structures, told him that during a pipe repair in 1979, workers had discovered storefront windows sealed behind the lobby walls. Big sheets of glass, the superintendent said, still in their frames, facing the wrong way. Shapiro requested the building's complete file from the Department of Buildings. The response, dated 14th of October 1987, stated that records prior to 1940 had been transferred to the municipal archives, and that many files from the 1920s and 1930s were incomplete due to water damage and deterioration. The case was settled without resolution of the underlying question. Were these apartments legal dwelling units, or were they commercial spaces that had been improperly converted decades earlier? The legal ambiguity persisted. By the 90s, as real estate values in Manhattan soared and landlords sought to convert rent-stabilized apartments to market-rate units, the history of these ground-floor spaces became relevant again. A landlord could not easily remove tenants from rent-stabilized apartments. But if the apartments were never legally residential to begin with, if they were commercial spaces that had been improperly converted, then the rent stabilization protections might not apply. A case filed in Housing Court in '94, preserved in the court's electronic database, hinged on this question. The landlord argued that the tenant's apartment on West 94th Street was originally a storefront, illegally converted in 1931, and therefore not subject to rent control. The tenant's attorney argued that the 1933 certificate of occupancy, which listed the space as residential, established legal residential use regardless of prior history. The judge ruled for the tenant, stating that, absent evidence of fraud in the obtaining of the 1933 certificate, the residential designation stands. But in his written opinion, the judge noted that the court is troubled by the apparent ease with which commercial spaces were reclassified as residential during the Depression era and by the lack of documentation regarding structural modifications. It appears that in many cases, spaces were simply renamed rather than renovated. In the spring of 2003, in an apartment on East 79th Street, the same building where Viktor Chernov had discovered the sealed plate glass, a new tenant noticed something unusual. The apartment, listed as a charming garden unit with high ceilings and period details, had walls that seemed too thick. When she hung a picture, the nail went through plaster, then lathe, then encountered open space before finally hitting a hard surface that felt like glass. She mentioned this to the superintendent, who by then had replaced the building's aging heating system and knew the structure's hidden layers. He told her about the plate glass, still sealed behind the walls, and about the 1921 permit that listed storefronts. The tenant, a graduate student in urban history at Columbia, began researching the building's past. In the municipal archives, she found the original blueprints, dated 1921, showing ground floor retail spaces. She found the 1923 marginal notation, changing the designation to residential. She found no record of the plate glass being removed or the storefronts being demolished. The conversion, it seemed, had been purely administrative. The physical structure remained commercial, only the paperwork had changed. Her thesis, completed in 2005 and available in Columbia's digital archive, documents what she called paper conversions, the practice of redesignating commercial spaces as residential through bureaucratic means, rather than physical renovation. She identified over 200 buildings in Manhattan where ground floor units showed characteristics of former storefronts, ceiling heights between 11 and 14 feet, unusually wide floor plans, windows at sidewalk level, and in some cases, evidence of sealed plate glass behind interior walls. The conversions, she concluded, were concentrated in the period between 1929 and 1937, corresponding with the Depression's impact on commercial real estate. The thesis includes photographs of several apartments where she convinced landlords to allow exploratory demolition. In each case, removing a section of interior wall revealed the same thing: original storefront windows. Time 400 store still in their frames, facing inward. The glass was often cracked or cloudy with age, but intact. Behind the glass, in some cases, remained fragments of the original stores, painted signs on brick walls, shelf brackets still bolted to limestone, tile floors that had once borne the weight of display cases. On the 17th of November, 2019, in a cafe on the Upper West Side, a real estate developer named Michael Torres reviewed plans for a gut renovation of a pre-war building he had recently purchased. The building, constructed in 1924, had 12 ground floor units listed as residential. Torres had noticed during his inspection that the floor-to-ceiling height in these units was 12 feet, unusually generous for residential space. When his architect examined the original plans, obtained from the municipal archives, they showed storefronts. The certificate of occupancy, however, dated from 1932 and listed the ground floor as residential. Torres faced a decision: renovate the units as apartments or attempt to restore them to commercial use. The commercial rents would be higher, but the conversion would require new permits, and the tenants, some of whom had lived in the building for decades, had rent-stabilized leases. His attorney advised that converting back to commercial use would be legally complex and expensive, possibly requiring tenant buyouts and lengthy court proceedings. It was easier and more profitable to simply renovate the units as high-end apartments, marketing the high ceilings and sidewalk-level windows as architectural features rather than evidence of the space's former lives. The pattern repeats across Manhattan. Buildings constructed in the 1920s with ground-floor retail, converted to residential use in the 1930s, now renovated as luxury apartments with no acknowledgement of their commercial origins. The plate glass remains sealed behind walls, a hidden layer of the city's history. The storefronts, renamed as garden apartments, then as English basements, then as ground-floor residences with soaring ceilings, have been absorbed into the residential fabric of the city. The language has changed, but the spaces themselves remain essentially unchanged. Rooms designed for commerce, repurposed for dwelling, their original function forgotten but physically present, like a palimpsest where the old writing shows through. In the winter of 24, in the offices of the Landmarks Preservation Commission on Broadway, a researcher compiling an inventory of historic commercial corridors noticed a pattern in the photographic archives. Images from the 1920s showed continuous retail frontages on residential side streets, not just on avenues, but on the numbered streets between them. By the 1950s, the same streets showed residential buildings, with small windows at sidewalk level and no visible storefronts. The transformation had been so complete that the earlier commercial presence had been erased from the streetscape and from memory. The researcher cross-referenced building permits and certificates of occupancy, finding hundreds of instances where ground-floor commercial spaces had been redesignated as residential between 1929 and 1937. In almost no cases did the permits document structural changes. The conversions existed primarily on paper. Today, on a warm afternoon in late spring, a commuter walks along East 79th Street, passing a building with small windows at sidewalk level, their frames set back in shallow wells that catch leaves and debris. The windows reveal glimpses of apartments, a bookshelf, a lamp, the corner of a sofa. The ceilings inside are high, the walls thick. Behind those walls, sealed and forgotten, plate glass windows still hang in iron frames, facing inward, catching no light. The occupants, paying market-rate rent for what real estate listings describe as unique ground-floor homes with period details, do not know they live in former shops. The landlord, who inherited the building from his father, knows only what the certificate of occupancy states: residential, 12 units, since 1932. The storefronts exist now only in archival photographs and in the hidden structure of the building itself. Spaces that were never demolished, only buried, their windows sealed but not removed, their purpose renamed but not erased. If architecture is memory made physical, and if cities are built in layers, then these ground floor apartments are palimpsests, their original text still present beneath the overwriting. The question Thomas Brennan posed in 1931, is this residential space or merely commercial space renamed, remains unanswered. The legal designation says residential. The physical structure says commercial. The tenants, living in what were once storefronts, occupy a liminal space. Not quite basement, not quite ground floor, time 400s. Neither fully commercial nor fully residential, but something in between, something that Manhattan created out of economic necessity and bureaucratic convenience during the Depression and never quite acknowledged. The plate glass behind the walls remains, patient and forgotten, waiting for the next flood, the next renovation, the next moment when the walls come down and the hidden layer is briefly exposed before being sealed again.